Welcome back to this week's lecture on World War II. We're going to cover three topics. We're going to cover the path to the Second World War. We're going to cover the course of the Second World War. And we're also going to look at how the war affected people on the home front. So we're going to start with the remilitarization of Germany, right? Germany is going to be the country that is responsible for causing the Second World War, and for them to get into a position where they can do that, some things have to take place. So Germany is going to go through a remilitarization process. They are going to break those provisions in the Treaty of Versailles, as we've discussed earlier. They are going to create an air force. They are going to increase their navy. They are going to build their army well above 100,000. And they're going to remilitarize the Rhineland. So we're going to take a look at a map right now and see what exactly that entails. So, so here we have a little bit of a crude map, but it will get the job done. We see Germany here in green. We see France here to the west of Germany. And then we see this light green area labeled the Rhineland. Now, it's important to note that the Rhineland is within the German border. The Rhineland is part of Germany, but it's part of Germany that borders France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and this is where the Germans in the First World War, they marched through this area into Belgium before coming into France. Now, along the French border and French territory, we have what's known as the Maginot Line, which is a highly defensible area. It's very fortified. Now, the idea behind the Rhineland being demilitarized is that for the Germans to attack the French, they would have to come through this demilitarized zone first, and it would give an indication to France so they could prepare for war. What Hitler and the Nazis do is they begin remilitarizing the Rhineland. They put their forces in this area, and it takes away that advance notice that France would have in the event of a German attack. Now, France is not happy about this, and they immediately turn to their ally Britain to do something about the Germans remilitarizing this area. The British, their attitude is that, well, the Rhineland technically is German territory. They're just putting soldiers and remilitarizing their own country. They're not taking territory away from anyone else. It's not really worth going to war from. And going to war for. And we're gonna see this policy, and it's gonna be a policy of appeasement, of giving into Hitler, of the fear of, well, if we call him out on his actions, if we call him out for breaking the rules, it might lead to war. So let's just let him have what he wants. It's going to be known as a policy of appeasement. We're going to see that starting here by allowing the Germans, the British say, yeah, France, we're not going to back you up on this. The French are appalled. And the Germans are going to remilitarize the Rhineland. They are preparing for war. And we're going to see how this plays out with a few other things. In addition to remilitarizing the Rhineland, in addition to just remilitarizing Germany in general, all this is going on with the backdrop of the 1936 Olympic Games. Now, you guys have gone over the 1936 Olympic Games a little bit in detail now, so you should know about that. But just to recap, the Olympic Games are going to be awarded to Germany before the Nazi takeover of Germany. So it's given to the German country kind of as a way of allowing them back into the world community. Once the Olympic Games have been awarded to Germany, the Nazis take over and they kind of inherit the Olympic Games. There's talks of boycott, there's all these things. What ends up happening, though, is that with all of these things going on, Germany remilitarizing, Germany, breaking the rules set in the Treaty of Versailles and going back into the Rhineland and militarizing it. They have a chance with the Olympic Games to set a propaganda machine in motion and kind of change the perspective, the world perspective on Germany from this like warlike country into a more peaceful and tolerant place. And then they use the Olympic Games to do exactly that. And it's going to be a huge victory for the Germans, where they are going to portray themselves as a more peaceful, tolerant nation than what people had previously perceived. And what that's going to do is allow them to get away with some more things as time goes on. So, in addition to those things, now Germany, regaining its kind of world power status, is going to start forming some alliances. So let's take a look at those alliances. So here we have the Axis powers, and what we have to understand is first there's the Rome Berlin Axis alliance, which is between Italy and Nazi Germany. Later, you're going to have the Japanese enter into an agreement with the Nazis, and you have the formation of these three world powers who have all kind of been at ends with the League of Nations, forming together to create what we call now the Axis powers. And these three countries are going to work together during the Second World War, leading up to the Second World War, through the Second World War, until essentially all three of them collapse. It's important to note that of these three countries, we have examples of totalitarian or authoritarian governments. The Nazi regime, the fascist regime in Italy, and the Empire of Japan, led by an emperor Hirohito, and led by some military prime ministers that have some very strong influence in the government. But we're looking at another very strict authoritarian type government. All right, so we're going to look at this map of Europe and just talk about some things that Hitler is doing. Okay, first, we're going to see that we have a Nazi takeover of Germany. Now we can see that little area there where it's the Rhineland. It's in Germany, but it hasn't been militarized yet. Well, the Germans are going to, as we know, militarize that Rhineland. The next thing is that Hitler, born in Austria, has a dream of uniting Austria once more with Germany. He's going to kind of give Austria an ultimatum that they're going to put either Nazi Austrians in control of their government, or the German Nazis are going to come into Austria and declare war on them. The Austrians capitulate. They allow these Austrian Nazis to take over the government. Immediately, once they gain power, they unite with Germany. This is going to be known as Anschluss. So it is German-Austrian Union, uniting Hitler's homeland back with Germany. Now, the next thing that's going to happen is we have this little area along the border of Germany and Czechoslovakia in Czechoslovakia. Now, at the end of the First World War, all of these new countries are created, giving people their own ethnic states. Well, it's not like there are clear borders dividing these ethnic groups. So some of these borders, they have some issues. And what we find in Czechoslovakia and this area that's going to be called the Sudetenland is that there are a lot of German people. Now Hitler is going to demand from Czechoslovakia that the Sudetenland is given back to Germany because there are so many German people in this region. Czechoslovakia says no, Germany is threatening them. Czechoslovakia goes to Great Britain and France for help. What we're going to have is the Munich Conference. And at the Munich Conference, Great Britain and France are going to sit down and they're going to negotiate with Germany on Czechoslovakia's behalf. In Czechoslovakia, they're too small to really defend themselves, so they're thinking that this is going to work out well for them. Unfortunately for Czechoslovakia, Great Britain and France are going to completely appease Hitler and give in to exactly what he wants. And they're going to give him the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland now becomes part of Germany. But Hitler isn't going to stop there, even though that's what he had agreed to do. He's going to continue, and he's just going to take all of Czechoslovakia. And the German Empire is now expanding. It's even greater than it was before. Well, not quite. There's still that whole chunk of Poland that's missing, but it's growing kind of back to that pre-World War I state. And that's what Hitler's aims are. At the end of the Munich conference, I mean, it's seen kind of as a disaster looking back. Chamberlain, the prime minister of Great Britain at the time, thinks that this is a huge victory, that war in Germany has been, war in Europe has been averted because of these great negotiation skills, even though that they've left the Czechoslovakians just, out to dry. And we find that giving in to Hitler's demands is not going to pacify him. He's just going to see that when he asks for something, when he demands something, he gets it. And it's going to embolden him to continue to ask for more. The next thing that he's going to ask for is Poland. He wants the half of Poland that belonged to Germany before the First World War. He wants that back. Great Britain and France kind of finally, at this point, put their foot down and say, no, you can't have Poland. If you go into Poland, this is going to mean war. This raises a huge issue. If Germany marches into Poland to their east, it could cause a conflict with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could see this as a threatening act, that Germany is going to come into the Soviet Union, and it could cause a war with the Soviet Union. Now, if they go into Poland, Great Britain and France have already said they would declare war, and now there's this issue that the Soviet Union might also go to war with Germany if the Germans go into Poland, which would put Germany in a very familiar situation, a very familiar bad situation, which is Germany would once again be fighting a two-front war, fighting both against the French and the British in the West, on the Western Front, and against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Hitler understands that this two-front war scenario is the major reason that Germany lost the First World War. And he is trying to figure out a way that he can avoid this at all costs, which is going to lead him to do something that he really hadn't entertained up until this point, which is to make an agreement or a pact with the Soviet Union, who ideologically he is completely opposed with. He does not like the communists in the Soviet Union. A Nazi communist alliance is not something that Hitler had been thinking about. He wanted to create an alliance with the British, the great Aryan sea power, and the Germans, the great Aryan land power. But after all the issues that they're having with Great Britain, seeing that this is not a possibility, he's now looking for an unlikely ally in the Soviet Union. So let's go ahead and talk about that Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact that is going to take place. August of 1939, Hitler is going to enter an agreement with the Soviet Union. So there's all these different pacts in there. This is a cartoon by Dr. Seuss kind of showing you all of these different pacts and how they're kind of like behind the back and under the table. And it's to kind of talk about the secret nature of them. They're kind of pinned in place, held on too fragilely, because these pacts we're going to find are not going to last very long. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact is going to allow Hitler to go into Poland, knowing that it will cause war in the West against the French and the British, knowing that he is safe from a war in the East with the Soviet Union. He's not worried about fighting Poland. It's going to be, it's going to be a slaughter, essentially. Poland is not a power that is going to keep him occupied for too long. So in August of 1939, we have the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, which is going to allow Hitler to go into Poland without the worry of causing a two-front war. Hitler is going to go into Poland just a few weeks later, on September 1st in 1939, and he is going to absolutely rout Poland. Within 2 weeks, he is going to take over the area of Poland that was um, you know, given to him per the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. We'll take a look at that. So, here we go. We have September 1st, 1939. German forces are going to invade Poland. Just a couple weeks later, the Soviet Union is going to go in on the east. Poland, who would not be able to stand against either one of these powers, is being attacked by both of these powers simultaneously. It is absolutely going to destroy Poland. Hitler is going to mass murder give orders to his soldiers to mass murder political opponents, as well as Jewish people. It's going to be his first real experience with mass murder. The Soviet Union, they're going to do very much the same, targeting people who are anti-communist and mass murdering them. Now, the idea here, and what we have to understand, is that Hitler has written a book about how the German people need more living space, or Lebensraum, in order to grow as a race, grow as a population, and kind of take over the world. And he says that this living space is to their east. And what he's talking about is Russia. And he writes this in his book, Mein Kampf, that he writes when he is in prison after the beer hall pushed. And it's no secret. Stalin has read the book. He understands that Hitler's agenda is to eventually go into the Soviet Union. He just thinks that this attack is coming much, much later than it actually will. It's still a little ways away, but Stalin thinks that he has some more time before Hitler is going to come after them. So for the time being, Poland is going to be routed. The Soviet Union understands that their pact is only going to last for a certain amount of time. Stalin thinks it's going to last for about 4 years. That's going to be a gross overestimation of how long it will last. Poland has been completely destroyed, and because of this, the British and the French have now declared war on Germany. But we enter a stage known as the phony war, meaning that war has been declared, but there's no real action going on. Britain and France are preparing to help with Poland, but it's far too late for Poland, and we are going to go into another stage of the war after the winter of 1940. Now, we've talked a little bit about what Germany was doing to kind of be at odds with the League of Nations. They are breaking the Treaty of Versailles, and we're going to see some more demands that Hitler's making too. But it's important to note that Japan is also going to be at odds with the League of Nations. This is why that alliance is going to take place. Japan does some interesting things. They are an Eastern country which has industrialized, and the East, for the most part, did not industrialize. Japan sees the need to industrialize. They industrialize. The problem is the West has been industrializing for a very long time, and there's not a lot of places for them to colonize. So really, the only way for them to get into this industrial game is to gain colonies, which means they're going to go and take over places that already have governments over them, that already have countries ruling them, which the League of Nations is against at this point. It's not that free land grab that existed, when the European countries were out just taking all the colonies that they wanted. So Japan gets creative, and they come up with some ways. It'd be wrong of them to start a war with China, to just go and take Manchuria. And be the one that is provoking the war. So a bunch of Japanese officials disguise themselves as Chinese soldiers, and they go and blow up a Japanese railway. And it's like, oh, look what the Chinese did to us. They blew up our railway, and now we have reason to declare war. And the consequence of that war is we're going to take over a whole bunch of land. Immediately something, it's like, oh, this is pretty fishy. The League of Nations sends in some people to investigate, and very clearly, like, the Japanese have set this whole, act of terrorism up to justify doing some things that they're not supposed to do. when all this comes to light, Japan says, you know what, we don't really want to be in the League of Nations anyways. We're just going to kind of do our own thing. And at that point, the aggression of Japan becomes much, much more. The Japanese are going to invade Manchuria. We're going to have an event take place known as, in history, is now known as the Rape of Nanjing. 200,000 civilians are going to be killed, during this invasion. 80,000, around 80,000 women are going to be raped. It is going to be just brutal. We talked in the First World War about the atrocities that took place when the Germans went into Belgium. And there were terrible things happening in Belgium. Yes, there were terrible things that the Germans were doing during the First World War in Belgium. But there's debate over how bad were they? Were some of these things exaggerated? There's no need to have that debate when talking about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the rape of Nanjing. These were clearly atrocities. There's no exaggeration. Terrible, terrible things happened. This is truly a crime against humanity. This is going to kind of solidify Japan's role as, against the League of Nations, against the rules and treaties and all the things that have been going on, and that they're going to kind of do what they want to do, which is very dangerous because now we have this Japanese country operating in the Pacific, looking for resources to fuel their industrial machine. That is going to lead to conflict with another country that is also in the that is in the Pacific, that has colonies and land holdings in the Pacific, which is going to be the United States. But we'll get to that momentarily. So back to the map. Next thing we have Italy is going to go over here and take Albania. And then we have the invasion of Poland by Hitler. There's his half of Poland, now part of the German Empire. And then we have the invasion of Poland by the USSR following just a couple weeks later. And we see how the map of Europe is changing. Now, France and Britain, like I said, have declared war on Germany, but there's going to be no fighting between the French and the British yet. The Germans are then going to do some other things. You're going to have Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all kind of pledge their alliance to Germany. So they're going to be part of this empire here. The Germans are moving into the Rhineland in preparation for war. And then we have just a very quick route of Denmark. And it goes so quickly that when Hitler gets there, he decides, you know what, we'll just go a little bit further. And they go to Norway, and they are going to take that over also. All is a precursor for them in 1940 to go into France. Now, as the Germans are going to begin attacking the French, they think that the little area just above where the Maginot Line is, we can see the Maginot Line there in blue, the heavily fortified area. They think that, the Germans won't attack there. Luxembourg, the reason that the Germans didn't go through Luxembourg in the First World War is because the Ardennes Forest was like this impenetrable forest. And the French still think that the Ardennes Forest is this impenetrable force, like it's as good as the Maginot Line. And the Germans are going to surprise the heck out of the French when they come rolling through Luxembourg and their tanks right through the forest and kind of sweep around the edge there of the Maginot Line. In the Germans go into Belgium. They begin taking over Belgium. The Belgians invite the British and the French into Belgium without violating their neutrality to fight the Germans off. But it seems to be a little too late. As the Germans push through the Ardennes Forest there, we can see that this is going to cause some major problems for the British and French, as they are now going to be encircled by the Nazis. The Nazis are employing a new type of warfare, blitzkrieg. And what we found in the First World War is we had the stalemate happen because there was nothing to replace that fast moving piece of warfare, which used to be fulfilled by the cavalry, because you couldn't have horses going against machine guns. Now, with light armor and tanks, that movement, that mobility in war is there, and also with the planes. In the Blitzkrieg, the Germans would send the planes in; they would blow up, areas much like the artillery strikes would, in the First World War, and then the tanks would roll in, much like a cavalry would, break holes through the line, and then the foot soldiers would march through those holes and fortify those positions. So we're going to end up with a little bit of an issue here, as the British and French soldiers are going to be encircled and trapped at the beaches of Dunkirk. So we'll talk about that later. But we can see, by pushing through here, we'll go back. Okay. So when they circle through, those forces are going to be stuck on the beaches of Dunkirk. So let's go ahead and take a break and talk about that. So here is a little crude map of Dunkirk, and we can see here there's Dunkirk and the port of Calais. And just across this English Channel, we have the port of Dover. And this represents a distance of, from Dunkirk to Dover, a little over 20 miles or so. It's not very far. I mean, you can stand on the shore of Dunkirk and you can see the coastline of Dover from there. The Nazi forces, because they're able to break through the Ardennes Forest and encircle the French and British forces, are going to essentially capture the entire British and French forces here on the beaches at Dunkirk. A massive evacuation is going to take place. The problem is that as these large ships are coming into Dunkirk and trying to get as many people on them as possible, there's no real air support, there's no artillery, there's nothing to protect the British and French soldiers who are trying to evacuate from the barrage of German airplanes that are coming in, and they're like sitting ducks. Those ships that are sitting there as people are getting on them, that are going across the channel, are being destroyed by the German Air Force, by the German Luftwaffe. And the evacuation, they're able to evacuate some people, but it's kind of a failure. And there is a situation in which the entire British and French army is about to be defeated immediately. And after a couple of days of trying different things with these German forces, closing in on them, they're driving, their vehicles into the water, the British and French are, to make these like makeshift platforms that the soldiers can walk out across to get to the ships. They're going to try something very unorthodox. And what happens is a bunch of civilian ships, the small ships, right, the small boats, are going to start coming over and taking as many soldiers as they can. And it's going to be the civilian effort that is going to make the evacuation of Dunkirk a success. And they're going to evacuate nearly all of the British soldiers. So many of the French are going to be captured. It's going to be a huge victory for the Germans, even with the British being able to evacuate successfully. They are leaving behind a ton of their weapons and their military force, their vehicles, their weapons, their ammunitions, along with the French soldiers, have all been captured. And the British are going to, be excited about how successful this evacuation of Dunkirk was going to become known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. And people are going to be celebrating it so much that Churchill, who is now the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to have to get on the radio and remind the people that wars are not won by evacuations, that we're going to have to bear down and fight at some point. Now, Hitler's feeling really well about everything. He thinks like, hey, I just won the war, I defeated Britain, I defeated France, this is excellent. Stalin is freaking out. He thought that this alliance between him and Hitler was going to benefit the Soviet Union, that Hitler was going to be involved in this war with France and Britain for years. And that was going to give him has 4 years, to essentially prepare for a German invasion. And then in 4 years, after Germany has been beaten down by the British and French, that beaten down force would be what the Russians were going to have to deal with, and that he was going to undermine. Hitler was going to undermine, this capitalist Europe by putting these capitalist countries, at odds and war, and their economies would fail, and communism and all stuff. But instead, Hitler goes in a matter of just, very quickly defeats these two powers, and the war seems to be over. Let's return to the map and see what happens next. So, while the Nazis have had all of their success with all of their battle plans, the Russians have been doing their own. They've been having their own battles. They are going to go into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with very little problem. And then they're going to go to Finland. And this is where they do, in fact, have a problem. Now, eventually the Russians are going to come out on top, but the Finns are going to put up a really big fight. And when the Soviet Unions go against this very small power in Finland and struggle, it shows that the Russians have some weaknesses. In addition to showcasing these weaknesses and struggling with the Finns, and suffering heavy casualties, as a response, Stalin is so infuriated with his officers that he sends NKVD officers, members of his secret police force, to the front lines to execute his officers for doing such a bad job in Finland. The Nazis find this amusing. Goebbels is going to remark that if the Soviets keep shooting their officers, then we won't need to. Stalin realizes very clearly that he has demonstrated a Soviet weakness at the same time that Hitler has demonstrated the Nazis' power. This is very problematic for the Soviet Union. Now, the British have been defeated by the Germans, so that the Germans think. But the British are refusing to actually surrender, which is infuriating the Germans, because the Germans can move forward with their plans to invade the Soviet Union as soon as they know for sure that the British aren't going to attack them on the other front. So Hitler needs to gain an official British surrender, and the British are being very stubborn and refusing to surrender. And this is going to cause Hitler to come up with a plan to invade Britain. Now, we know other people have come up with similar plans, and they've always struggled because Britain has the advantageous position of being an island with a very strong navy, which creates some problems. So Hitler is going to come up, he's going to develop a plan. It's going to be called Operation Sea Lion. And this plan is how he is going to defeat the British. So let's go ahead and take a look at that plan right now.
Hitler and his generals feverishly drafted their plans for the conquest of Britain. Every detail must be anticipated. A slip now might wreck the whole timetable of world conquest. 6 weeks of final preparation went into those plans. 6 weeks to determine the history of 1,000 years. The thing was foolproof. See for yourselves how simple the whole operation was to be. Look. German plan for invasion of England. Phase 1. Knock out the Royal Air Force and its bases. Get control of the air and the sea lanes across the Channel. Follow the Blitz plan that had wiped out Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Destroy communication and transport lines. Above all, get command of the air. Phase 2. Pulverize the coastline with dive bombers. Drop parachute troops to take over the airfields and establish beachheads. Phase 3. Actual invasion. pour the German panzer divisions across in high-speed barges under an umbrella protecting fighter planes. Then send spearheads of armed might to divide, surround, destroy all opposition. That's all there was to it. Conquer Britain. Force the surrender of the British fleet. Then, with the combined sea power of Germany, Britain, Italy, France, and Japan, he could control the seas and...
Okay, so we return to the map, and we're going to see the attempt of the Germans to take over Britain. And there's that Battle of Britain, fought in the air, and that is not going to work out for the Germans. The British are going to successfully defend it. The British are also going to land in Greece. So we see the British down here in Greece. Now, Hitler has decided that the British are defeated. Yeah, they can defend their little island, but they can't attack me, right? They can't attack, in the West. So he sees that this threat of a war on his Western front as being no longer a threat. And now he is thinking about that attack on the USSR. So Germany is preparing what's going to be known as Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union. But before they can do it, they have to make sure that the British are out of Greece. Because if Germany starts going into the Soviet Union, the British could, essentially outflank them and attack that southern flank and cause some problems for the Germans as they go into the Soviet Union. So the plan is that the attack on the Soviet Union is going to take place in May. Hitler gives the task of taking over Yugoslavia and Greece. He gives that task to Mussolini. Mussolini is going to go into Yugoslavia and be defeated. And Hitler is going to have to postpone his attack on the Soviet Union in order to go down and take care of Yugoslavia himself. So there go the Nazi forces in Yugoslavia. And then after that, into Greece. They're going to push the British back to the island of Crete. Eventually, they're going to take that also for a very short period of time, actually. So now, with his southern flank protected, Hitler can now attack into the Soviet Union. The problem is it's no longer May. The time that it took the Nazis to take Yugoslavia and Greece has postponed that attack by a couple months. And now we're looking at a very interesting date, June 22nd. June 22nd is when the French surrendered in the year prior. June 22nd is also the date that Napoleon attacked attacked Russia, way back when. And we all know how that ended. It ended with the French getting into the Soviet Union, or getting into Russia, sorry, and then the winter, happening and defeating the French soldiers and all this stuff happening. And on June 22nd, Hitler is going to invade the Soviet Union. He's going to do it on the same date as Napoleon's failed attack. And much like Hitler is going to fail invading Great Britain as Napoleon did, Hitler is going to have some of the same struggles that Napoleon did in trying to take the Soviet Union. Initially, it's going to go very well. Stalin is not expecting an attack. He has spies. Stalin has, Soviet spies in the German Air Force who are telling him, hey, we're getting orders, this invasion's happening. He won't listen to his spies. His officers are looking, across and like, hey, the Germans are getting ready to attack us, it looks like. And Stalin's like, no, you don't understand. They would never attack us. Churchill of Great Britain is like, hey, we have intelligence. The Germans are getting ready to attack you. And Stalin thinks like, oh, it's a trap. They're just trying to get us to attack them first. They're trying to cause a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. That wouldn't happen otherwise. So Stalin, even though he's being warned by several legitimate sources that the German attack is imminent, he won't hear it. And instead of preparing for a German attack, he actually pulls his soldiers back out of very good positions to defend. He pulls them back away from these positions because he doesn't want the Germans to think that that we think that they're going to fight a war, because then they might see us, as the ones who started the war. So he pulls his soldiers back from the front, and puts them in some very vulnerable positions. And when the Germans come in on this attack, which is going to be known as Operation Barbarossa, they are absolutely going to decimate the Soviet forces at first. Stalin is going to be furious. He has no one to blame but himself, but he refuses to blame himself, and instead he blames his officers, once again sending his NKVD officers to the front line to execute his generals for being in such poor positions that Stalin himself had told them to be in. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. There we have the Nazi forces getting ready for Operation Barbarossa. And in those Nazi forces go. And very quickly, they are going to be in positions that are extremely advantageous, just outside of Stalingrad, just outside of Moscow, just outside of Leningrad. And here we have kind of the height of the Nazi Empire. Everything is going right, for the Nazis. And they have basically the entire continent of Europe either under direct Nazi control or under the control of collaborators with the Nazi regime. From this point forward, things are going to begin to fall apart for the Nazis. We still have Britain on their west, who is planning a way to attack. They have the new enemy in their east, the Soviet Union, who they just attacked. And what is going to be happening on the other side of the world is the Japanese are going to be moving forward with their plan of a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor against the United States, bringing in the United States, who is going to be against the Germans as well as the Japanese and the Italians. So Germany goes from being kind of this very powerful position, whereas Germany, just versus Britain, who has really no, way to fight against the Germans, to being Germany against the British, the Russians, and the United States. So let's go ahead and take a look now at Pearl Harbor. So phase one of Operation Sea Lion is going to begin, and the Germans have to first establish air superiority over the British Isles. And this is going to be the first battle in the history of the world that is going to be decided in the air. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, is going to go up against the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to see if they can defend Britain against the Luftwaffe. Now, there are going to be several advantages that the Germans have as the attackers. The Germans can choose when the attack will begin. They've taken over France, so they have, they're flying essentially from France over to British. So what they do to the British island. So what they decide is that they should go first thing in the morning. Now, why would the Germans decide to go first thing in the morning? Well, the sun rises in the east, and as these German airplanes are flying from France in the east to the British Isles, they're flying out of the sun. And for the British fighters who are defending, they're looking directly into the sun, trying to see these German planes, and it makes it very difficult to see them and fight against them. And essentially, the Germans are going to fly in, they're going to bomb strategic places, and they're going to turn around and fly back. Now, the British have a ton of advantages as the defense. So first off, the British, they have radar, so they can see when the Germans are coming. They're going to be aware of it. Because they're defending, they don't have to worry about conserving fuel or anything like that. They're going to be directly over, their island and in the vicinity of it. Not worrying about having enough fuel to get back to, a position like the Germans are. They're going to set up like traps. Essentially, they set up these balloons that have these, long metal wires attached to them. So if you're a German plane and you're flying, you wouldn't see this just like random metal wire just hanging from the sky because it's like attached to this balloon, and you would fly in it and it would get caught into your propeller, and it would cause the plane to go down. The British are going to be supported with anti-aircraft guns. So the British have all these advantages. In addition to that, the British have a ton of small airfields. So they're able to scramble all of their airplanes up at once rather than having like one big airfield where there's one big target and it takes a long time for all these planes. They have a bunch of small targets scattered all over the British countryside where they can simultaneously just get all these planes up in the air at once. So these are going to be some major advantages. Now, the Germans are going to have the British on the ropes, so to speak. Now, the British planes, the Spitfire is going to be, that's the small, fighter plane, is going to be a better plane than what the Germans have. It's faster, it's more maneuverable, it's going to give them an advantage, but there are far more planes in the German Air Force. The German Air Force pilots, they've had a little bit of experience. When they were flying over Spain in the Spanish Civil War, when they were supporting Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. But that's the extent of their experience. They've had a little bit more experience, in Poland and Denmark and going in France. But I mean, this is all just kind of like relatively new. The British pilots are very good and they have a ton of experience. And that's going to give them a leg up too. As the battle goes on, by sheer numbers, the Germans are winning. And then something is going to happen that really changes the course of the war. It looks like they're going to finish phase one, they're going to move on to phase two, and Operation Sea Lion is on its way to being a success. And that's when the Germans drop some bombs on a civilian population. They drop it on this little neighborhood, like outside of London, which just happens to be a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Now, the Germans claim that it's a mistake, but given the German precision, given the fact that it was a Jewish neighborhood, it's very unlikely that this was a mistake. And the British are going to respond by sending some bombers over to Berlin. And they drop some bombs in Berlin. It's going to be very little actual impact, but psychologically the impact is significant because Hitler had promised the German people that not one bomb would drop in Germany during this war, and the British have now turned him into a liar, and he's infuriated by this. And from that point forward, Hitler decides rather than finish the job of phase one and finish going after these airplane factories and finish getting these airfields at this crucial moment when the British are on the ropes, he does an all-out attack against civilian populations. He orders this attack. It's going to happen at 5 o'clock, just when people are getting off of work, so everyone is out in the streets, and these German bombers begin just bombing civilian populations, and this is going to go on for an extended period of time. So much of the fact that everyone is bunkered down. They're in underground bunkers. People are going to the countryside. Women and children are leaving the cities. All these other things, and this targeting of civilians by the German bombers is going to take place for a long time at a crucial moment when he had the British on the ropes. What this allows the British to do is mend their planes, heal their pilots, fix their airstrips, repair their factories, and when the Germans finally do switch the focus off the civilians and back to the military targets, we find that the British who were on the ropes seem to be very strong and recovered at this point, and they're able to kind of push back really hard against the Germans, and phase one is never completed. Phase two can never happen, and the invasion of Britain is put off indefinitely, and we're not going to see the German Air Force at the strength that it was before the attack on Britain. We're not going to see that German Air Force at that strength again for the rest of the war, which is going to be a crucial thing, come the attacks at Normandy later on in the war, not having that air support. This is going to be seen as, it's not a actual defeat, but this is going to be kind of the first major defeat of the Nazis the British being able to fend them off. Now, the United States has been kind of playing this back and forth game with the British. When the war first starts, Roosevelt is on the line with Churchill, promising him, all these World War One destroyers and all of this aid and support, and then before any of that support really gets there, the Germans immediately, kick the French's butts. They get the British evacuating, and FDR is like, well, I'm not going to support a losing cause, and then he kind of retracts that aid that he said he was going to give. And now, now that the British are, showing that they have the fighting spirit, now we're going to, oh, okay, maybe we will give you a little bit of aid. But that aid is kind of an interesting thing, right? We don't want to make the same mistake that we made in the First World War. We're getting so financially invested in someone that we have an interest in them winning the war. So we have a cash and carry policy, meaning that we're not allowing them to purchase anything on debt, purchase anything on credit, sorry, that they have to pay in cash, and they have to come and pick it up, and they have to take it themselves. That way, if it gets sunk on the way, that we're not going to get dragged into this war. Eventually, the British are going to run out of money, and Roosevelt's going to do some very creative things in order to continue to fund the British. We cannot, Congress says we cannot produce things and sell them to the British on credit. So he starts kind of this Lend-Lease Act where we are not selling them things on credit. We are lending them these things, and they're going to pay us at a later date. It's kind of his way of kind of circumventing what Congress's intentions really were. In addition to that, the United States is viewing, or not the United States, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt is really viewing the British as, the fighters, and he's seeing like the United States, we could fund this war against Hitler. He sees that Hitler is a threat to democracy, and he says, we can be the great arsenal of democracy. We can allow the British to do the dirty work, the fighting, and give them the weapons to do it. And that's why he's trying to kind of ignore some of the rules of Congress and get these weapons, get these supplies in the hands of the British to do the fighting so that American soldiers would not have to do it. Now, our hand is going to be forced a little bit later by the Japanese, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so we're back with this map here, and we can see, here we were just talking about the Nazis pushing through the Ardennes Forest, encircling the French and the British at Dunkirk, and the evacuation at Dunkirk of the British soldiers. But realistically, the end result of it is that the Germans take over everything that they tried. And we have France now surrender to Germany. And it's this whole like crazy thing. Hitler goes and he gets the train car that the Germans, surrendered to the French at the end of the First World War. They get the train car that surrender took place. He gets that train car out of a museum and he forces the French officials into this train car and sign their surrender as a humiliation to the French, and kind of a way to rectify the defeat of the Germans in the First World War. And he feels that their name has been has been cleared of all all the mud that has been slung on it as a result of the damages of the First World War. He sees they have retribution finally. Now, the Nazis are going to control the northern part of France. The southern part of France is going to be given to a World War I French hero, Pétain, who is going to lead Vichy France, which is going to be a collaborating country with the Nazis. So France is going to exist kind of as three different entities. You have Nazi-controlled France. You have Vichy France, who is working with Nazi-controlled France, and then you have a man by the name of Charles de Gaulle, who has fled to Britain, who is going to be the leader of Free France, which doesn't have any place on a map, but it represents people who are trying to liberate France and take it back out of control of the Nazis and the Vichy French. Now, the Vichy French, they agree to a lot of different things, collaborating with the Nazis on their agenda against the Jewish population. They are using their naval forces to aid Nazi operations. They are allowing the French soldiers who were captured at Dunkirk to remain as prisoners, and they are aiding the Germans with their conquest. So we have a Europe that looks very, very different at this point. So the Japanese understand that in order to go against the United States, they're going to need to gain a very quick advantage. And it needs to be a quick war. The longer the war goes on, the more the advantage goes to the United States. So the plan is to launch a surprise attack against the United States at Pearl Harbor, at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where we have a ton of our battleships, aircraft carriers, all kinds of ships there. They're going to launch this surprise attack against us, cripple our navy, and then follow it up with kind of attack after attack, taking over the South Pacific before we have an opportunity to do anything about it. Some things are going to go very well for the Japanese in this attack against Pearl Harbor, but there are going to be some other things that are not going to go so great. For one, none of our aircraft carriers are going to be at Pearl Harbor during this attack. They're all out on like a training exercise, very convenient for us. So when the Japanese forces arrive at Pearl Harbor to attack the United States, all of our aircraft carriers are safely somewhere else. And aircraft carriers are going to be like the deciding factor in these ocean battles. There are a ton of there are a ton of battleships at Pearl Harbor, and the attacks are going to destroy a lot of these battleships. They come in with planes. They come in with little mini subs. The planes are fitted with torpedoes, so that the plane can drop the torpedo into the harbor. The torpedo hits the water and it travels until it hits the boat. They're going to sink several of our battleships. They're going to destroy a ton of our planes on the airfield, and we are going to do very little about it. We're able to get, I think, 2 planes in the air to kind of counter this strike. Both those planes are going to be shot down. We're going to man some guns, on some of these battleships, and we're going to be shooting most of these shots are going to be, end up going into like causing casualties of Hawaiian civilians because, we're kind of like shooting errantly into the air. And the Japanese come, they attack, they leave, and it's a devastating attack on the United States. Now, the Japanese think that the American spirit is going to be kind of like broken and destroyed, and that we're just going to kind of roll over and accept defeat. And what happens instead is that they awaken this sleeping giant. And all of the success they have in sinking all these battleships, it's not going to be as successful as they think, because they sink these battleships in a shallow harbor. Some of them are destroyed beyond repair. But a lot of these battleships, we literally go down to where they're sunk, we weld them back up, we pump the water out, and we bring these battleships back up to the surface in a matter of months. We repair these ships, and we get our fleet out on the Pacific, fighting against the Japanese far sooner than they ever thought possible. As soon as this happens, we declare war on Japan. We're not going to declare war on the Nazis. Maybe we are, maybe we're not, but we don't do it, immediately. As we're declaring war on the Japanese, but before we even have a chance to make that decision about whether or not we're going to go to war with the Nazis declare war on us. And just like that, the big 3 is born. We have Stalin of the Soviet Union, Churchill of Great Britain, and FDR of the United States in this coalition known as the Big 3. They're going to meet at Tehran. It's going to be known as the Tehran Conference. It's the first meeting of the Big 3. And they're going to meet here to discuss kind of battle strategy. Stalin wants immediately for the United States and Britain to attack, the French coastline, and the United States and Britain are like, man, that's gonna be suicide. We don't want to do that. We want to, attack some other places that are going to be a little bit easier. Stalin, accuses the British of being cowardice and all this stuff, and there's a lot of hidden agendas. The Soviets, they want the British and the United States to have to take on a whole bunch of casualties like they have been taking on in this war. That way, if there's a war after World War II against the Soviet Union and Britain, that one force isn't stronger than the other. Or if there is a stronger force, that it's them and not the other, not going to be their enemy. So there's a lot of that going on in making these plans where, we want the other guy to be the one that takes all the casualties, not us. So Stalin is really pushing hard for this, invasion of the French coastline. Britain is pushing hard against it. We decide that we are going to go ahead and go forward with this attack on the French coastline, but we delay it. And we say instead, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a foothold in North Africa. And this is going to be known as Operation Torch. And we're going to launch some of the first amphibious attacks in the war, where United States, Britain, we are, coalition army. We are going over to North Africa. We're landing in North Africa. We are getting troops on the beaches. We are establishing, points of attack and attacking the Nazis. Now we're going to go up against one of the great Nazi generals, Edwin Rommel, in North Africa. But because of the fighting that is going on against the Soviet Union, and because of how large the Nazi Empire has become, Rommel cannot get the support and reinforcements that he needs to fight off the United States and the British successfully. The German tanks are going to be superior to what the U.S. tanks are. Our Sherman tanks, we don't have armor that can withstand the shots from the German tanks. Our guns on our tanks aren't strong enough to shoot through the armor of the German tanks. We're highly outmatched. But because he can't get supports, because reinforcements and supplies and things like this, Rommel is going to be defeated by the Americans and the British. We are going to push through at El Alamein and take the North African continent. And this is going to kind of be our launching point for some other battles in the war. This is going to be a kind of the first defeat of the Nazis. So let's go ahead and take a look at that on the map. So here we see the United States and Britain coming to North Africa. They're going to make those beach landings. The Nazis are going to try and head them off. Now, when the United States and British forces land in North Africa, Vichy France is being tasked with preventing that from happening. When Vichy France fails to keep the United States and Britain out of North Africa, Nazi France takes over the rest. There's no more Vichy France. There's no France other than Nazi France, and then the Free French forces that are fighting alongside the British. Nazi forces are going to meet the Americans and British in North Africa. And after a couple initial defeats, or victories, I should say, by the Nazis, the Americans are going to be able to push back, stop them from breaking through. That's at El Alamein. And the Nazi forces are going to be, some are captured, some are going to flee, but we are going to take over the continent of North Africa and establish positions there in North Africa, which we're going to use for the rest of the war in carrying out other plans. So there are going to be some other major turning points in the war. When it looks like everything is going right for the Axis powers, the Allies are able to turn the war kind of on its head and switch the advantage back going the other way. Since the attack at Pearl Harbor, everything has been kind of coming up Japanese. We have the Battle of Coral Sea, where one of our aircraft carriers is going to be sunk and the Japanese, kind of herald this as a victory, but not so fast. As this aircraft carrier at Coral Sea is going down, we, it's basically like on its side, and we're like pulling all of like any kind of furniture or anything out of the ship and burning it as fuel as it's filling up the water, and we're trying to get it to limp all the way back to Pearl Harbor, and we're able to get it to Pearl Harbor. And there's like an estimated time of like several months in order to get it fixed. We're going to fix it in just a couple short days, pump the water out, get it welded, fix the deck, get it ready, battle ready, and send it out for the next battle, which is going to be this huge, decisive battle in the Pacific and a major turning point in the Pacific. So we're going to take a closer look right now at the Battle of Midway. So here's a map of the Battle of Midway. And now what what the Japanese don't know is that the United States has broken their code. We are listening to their coded messages, and we know what they're saying for the most part. Now, they're talking about an attack, and we hear them talking about this attack via coded messages, but we're not sure where they are going to attack because they are using this code name for an island, and we don't know what the code names for the different islands are. So what we do is we send out uncoded messages in hopes that the Japanese will hear them. The Japanese have not broke our code. Our code is like based on the Navajo language, which made it very difficult for anyone to break. So we send these uncoded messages out, and we say things like, "Oh, on this island we're having issues. We need to have there's these fires that we need to get put out. On this other issue we're having water issues." And we need to get these taken care of. And we assign all of these different islands these imaginary problems that we say that these islands are having. And then we listen to the Japanese coded messages. And we listen to which island they say has a water problem. We listen to which island they say has an issue with fires. We listen for all of this counterintelligence that we just put out there, and we're able to decode the names, the code names of the islands that they're talking about. And what we can figure out is that they're planning this attack on Midway Island, and that they're going to send, like this little attack up to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and they're going to use this as a diversionary attack. And when we send our troops, our ships from Midway up to the Aleutian Islands to head off this attack of the Japanese on the Aleutian Islands, that they're going to come and take Midway. Knowing all of this, we devise this plan, right? And it works out really well. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers are going to show up just outside of Midway, waiting, for this attack to take place. The attack on the Aleutian Islands begins, and the United States pretends to take the bait, and they start sending their aircraft carriers up to the Aleutian Islands. When this happens, the Japanese think that their plan is working perfectly. They send all of their planes to attack Midway Island, leaving their aircraft carriers undefended. The ships that we had, kind of headed up toward the Aleutian Islands because like we were going to, take the bait, they're not actually going up to the Aleutian Islands. They're just taking a position to where when those planes attack Midway, we can send our planes to the Japanese aircraft carriers and attack those aircraft carriers while they're undefended. Midway is going to be absolutely just bombed and destroyed by these Japanese planes. But while that's going on, we are destroying these Japanese planes. And we have this surprise aircraft carrier out there. It's an aircraft carrier that they thought they had sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. It's back on the ocean just a couple days later and having a huge impact in this war. This strategy is going to be perfect. It's going to work out perfectly for the United States for the most part. We are going to sink 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers, once and for all, kind of taking away that superiority that the Japanese had following the attack at Pearl Harbor. They're going to sink 1 of our carriers. It's the Yorktown. It's that one that was sunk at Coral Sea, but that we fixed and sent out there. They do sink it. We're trying to limp it back to Pearl Harbor, and then it's struck by a torpedo from a submarine that really does put it down under the water once and for all. But this is going to be a major turning point in the Battle of the Pacific. And from this point forward, it's going to come up all the United States, kind of island hopping, taking back all the islands that we lost, and pushing the Japanese back to the main island of Japan before we began with invasions there. Midway isn't going to be the only place where there are major turning points in the war. At Stalingrad, there's going to be a major turning point in the war where the Germans are very close to taking over Russia completely, and the Russians are going to make like these really strong stands and keep the Germans at bay. Now, the Russian tanks are going to be very good, and they're going to be in some ways better than the German tanks. And one of the things that the Russians can do that the Germans cannot is produce tanks very quickly. And you're going to have this point in the war where the Germans are destroying more Russian tanks than the Russians are destroying German tanks, but they are going to disassemble tank factories in other places in Russia, put the pieces of the machinery of these factories on trains, and bring them to the battle, reassemble these factories, and then begin just producing tanks, so that tanks are just rolling out of these factories onto the battlefield. So it doesn't matter how many Russian tanks are destroyed by the Germans, because the Russians are making them just as quickly as they're being destroyed. It is going to be heavy casualties suffered by the Soviet Union, but they are going to dig in and they are going to be able to defeat the Germans at Stalingrad. And that's going to be another major turning point in the war, where the Germans are now going to be on the retreat. And we're going to see kind of the beginning of the end of the Germans, where the German Empire, this huge expanse, it starts collapsing and falling back in on itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at the map again and see how that is happening. So here's the map, and we're going to see those forces in North Africa moving up, taking Sicily, making landings in Italy. It's kind of thought of as like the soft underbelly of the Nazi Empire. And you can see the Russians begin pushing back and getting the Germans on the defense and on the retreat. And we start making preparations for D-Day. Now, we think that D-Day is going to be we've been kind of delaying it because it's going to be the French coastline is so heavily fortified. There's going to be major casualties when this happens. But some things happen. There's a storm that happens, and it's also Rommel, who is now the commander, who was in North Africa but is now kind of the commander that is in charge of that French coastline, the defense of it. It's his wife's birthday. There's this huge storm, so he decides to leave the front, leave another guy in charge. The guy that's in charge, in his absence, kind of disagrees with a lot of the things that Rommel was doing, and kind of tries to make these changes to these plans. So D-Day is going to be kind of this golden opportunity for us, because the German Air Force has kind of all been pulled back away from the coastline to get repaired, because they think that there's no attack coming. The storm, they really think there's no attack coming. We've been doing all of these like counterintelligence measures where we have what's known as this ghost army, and it's going to kind of evolve throughout the war. It starts off with kind of like these actors that have been hired to spill fake intelligence essentially to the Germans, so the Germans think that they kind of know what's going on. We have all these inflatable tanks and trucks and these speakers that play music, like not music but sounds of like tanks and trucks and heavy machinery. And from the air you can see and hear, and you think that there's this whole army division, and the Germans would see this huge army division, with all these tanks, not knowing that they were just inflatables and stuff. And they would start to move their pieces, their actual tanks, in preparation for this maneuver that's going to happen. And at night we would deflate all these things, throw them in like the back of a couple trucks, drive them somewhere else, inflate them somewhere else, and boom, the next day it would pop up somewhere else, and the Germans are scrambling to try and counter these things, and they think they know where the real attack's coming, but it's really just this fake army. There's a lot of this counterintelligence going out prior to D-Day, and the Germans think they have an idea of where we are going to attack. So when the attack begins to happen in a place that they think that, oh, no, this isn't where they're going to attack, they think it's a diversionary tactic. And they're waiting at the port of Calais where the real attack is going to happen while the real attack is happening at the beaches at Normandy. So we can see some bombing going on in Germany here. See some more airstrikes. We'll get to the good stuff here. Russian pushing back, getting them out of Russian territory in some places. So here we go. We have the prelude to the D-Day attacks, landing some troops on the beaches, and then there go those landings. Normandy, these are the D-Day landings here. And now the United States and Britain have a foothold in Western Europe. And you can see the Soviet Union closing in from the east, and now there's a place for the US and the British to fight in the west, and we have the US and the British also coming up from the south. The two-front war that Hitler was trying to avoid has become a reality for him. And it's becoming very apparent that this war is not going to go well. Once we're successful with the D-Day attacks, Operation Overlord, the big three have another meeting. And this meeting is going to be at Yalta. And at Yalta, they're not discussing necessarily battle strategies. What they're discussing now is, well, battle strategies are going well. Clearly, we're going to win the war. When we win the war, how are we going to divide Europe up? Who's getting what? What are we going to do with all these countries? Russia is really trying to get their half of Poland back, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And I mean, these ideas, like, hey, are we going to, are two democratic powers, Great Britain and the United States, going to allow the country of the Soviet Union to just take over Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and half of Poland by force? And in fear of not being able to defeat the Germans without them, we allow for these deals to be made. So that's what's going to take place at Yalta. Now, we can see kind of the collapse of the Nazi Empire. We're going to kind of push through this pretty quickly. You can see it all start to collapse in on them. As the forces begin to liberate France. And at this point now, with the Germans all but defeated, the Americans and the British are thinking that the real enemy could, in fact, be the Soviet Union. I mean, and Churchill says things to that effect throughout the war. And the idea is it's a race to Berlin for a couple of reasons, right? They want to have influence in these areas, but also there are scientists that have been developing weapons, that have been developing new technologies. German technology, in a lot of regards, is far beyond what the other countries are doing. The Germans have created a stealth plane. They have created jet engines. They are shooting the V2 rockets at Great Britain from this point in the war through the remainder of the war. And this is all technology that the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, they want. They want access to these scientists so that we have access to these technologies in the future, because whoever has these technologies, they're going to gain a big advantage as a world power. So there is a race to Germany to get access to these things. But as we're going, we are finding something else. Here we see France is being liberated. We start liberating these concentration camps and death camps that the Germans have been using. And we knew that there was violence against the Jewish population, but we're only now at this point in the war becoming aware of the extent to which this violence had been taking place against the Jewish population. We're going to be talking a lot more about the Holocaust in a different lesson. So we can see more troops coming over from Britain. We can see Russia really pushing through. There was a big fight, this whole idea that the British wanted to come through Greece and Yugoslavia and Albania to make sure that these areas weren't communist. And the Soviets really pushing hard against that. Greece is not going to fall to communism later, but Yugoslavia and Albania will. They'll become satellite states of the Soviet Union. And then we can see the United States getting stalled out a little here and then pushing back. The Russians pushing forward. And then just outside of Berlin. And eventually, as we capture Nazi forces and enclose on the capital, it becomes very apparent that it is all over for the Nazis. And it's almost as quickly as the Nazi Empire has risen, it falls just as quickly. The dictators are going to fall victim to some very horrendous deaths. Mussolini is trying to escape Italy and get to Germany to be under the protection of Hitler. And on his way, he's disguising himself as like a foot soldier, but someone sees like, wait, he's got a normal soldier's coat on, but look at his pants, it has stripes on it, he's an officer, and they're able to identify him as Mussolini. They rip him out of the car, they beat him, and stone him, and then they have his body kind of on display. They hang it up outside of a gas station. People are like throwing things at it, and it's just very, very brutal death that befalls Mussolini. Hitler is going to be in a bunker. He's going to commit suicide as Soviet forces are nearing Berlin, and then in addition to Hitler and Mussolini dying, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of the United States, he's also going to die. He's old. He has some health issues. He's going to pass away. So at this huge moment in our history, the leadership of these countries is going to change drastically. Even the leadership of the victors. Churchill is not going to be elected prime minister. Then we can see, here are the things they discussed at Yalta, how they're going to divide everything up. And we have a divided Germany. And we're going to be talking about that divided Germany in our Cold War unit a little bit later. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. We're going to talk about now the Pacific Theater, just a little bit more, and the war crime trials that are going to follow the end of the war in the European theater. So the war in Europe is over. They defeat the Nazis, but there's still a war going on against the Japanese. And it's not like just because the Nazis are out, the Japanese are going to surrender. The Japanese are not going to surrender. It's kind of this attitude, death before dishonor, where they are not going to surrender. Rather than everybody dies, rather than surrender. And the United States has been working on some technology themselves. We talked about kind of the stealth technology, the rockets and the jet engines and all the stuff that the Germans have been working on. The United States has been working on atomic capabilities. And we have created an atomic bomb. And we've successfully used this atomic bomb. And we are going to decide to use the atomic bomb in lieu of doing like this invasion of Japan, which could cost many, many American lives. We are going to drop an atomic bomb at Hiroshima. We do that. We drop this atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and it is devastating. And we wait for the Japanese to surrender, and they do not. And we drop a second bomb at Nagasaki. And following that, the Emperor Hirohito kind of intercedes on, they have the Prime Minister of War, Hideki Tojo. We're gonna just continue fighting, and Hirohito says no. We're done, and the Japanese are going to surrender. Tojo is going to try to commit suicide. He fails at killing himself. Um, but the Japanese are going to surrender, and we're going to do it before. I mean, there's other things. Not only is it just American casualties, but now the Soviet Union is going to help us, and they're going to come in, and it's like now we're in a whole like land grab issue again with the Soviet Union. So we end it very quickly using these atomic capabilities. Now, these atomic capabilities, it's just like any other weapon in the military. We develop a new plane, or we develop a new gun, or we develop a new ammunition round. The military has it. They decide what to do with it. We developed a new bomb, and the military decides when we use it. The thing is that this bomb isn't like any other advance in technology up to this point. This is something very different, very big. So when Truman starts getting he's given kind of a brief, like, hey, and he gets on the TV, and he explains to the American people that we've dropped this bomb, and he's kind of bragging about the power of this bomb, and then he starts getting the facts about how many civilians were injured, and how many were killed, and how devastating this bomb was. And not only that, but he's also getting news that we dropped a second one already. And at that point, he steps in as president, and he says, no more. The military will not use these bombs without express presidential permission. And they take the capability of these bombs away from the military and put it in the president's hand, so that he is a check on that military power. It wasn't that Truman necessarily authorized these attacks, the use of these weapons. It's more the military used it, and that presidential power of having authority over these bombs comes out of that. These are going to be the only two times that a country has dropped an atomic bomb in a war. We've tested a bunch of them, but dropped them on a population. We dropped them on a civilian population twice. You can make the argument that these were military targets, but realistically, there were huge civilian casualties. Now the war is really over, and it's time to kind of decide a couple different things. The big three are going to meet now with somebody new in the mix. We're going to have Truman, Roosevelt's vice president, now acting as president because Roosevelt has died. At the Potsdam Conference, you still have Churchill. Churchill hasn't been, not elected as prime minister yet. It's coming. But you have Churchill, Truman, and Stalin all meeting and discussing kind of how are governments going to be formed, new governments going to be formed in these countries like Germany and Italy and Yugoslavia and all these things. And the idea is that we're going to have free elections. It's going to be the Potsdam Conference. And we're going to find that these free elections are going to be facilitated by the country that liberated them. So if the United States liberated this country, they're going to help them facilitate free elections. If the Soviet Union liberated this country, they're going to help them facilitate free elections. And we find that the free elections that the Soviet Union facilitates aren't exactly as free as we would like them to be. And in these free elections, they nominate communist leaders. There's another thing to do. Well, what do we do with these Nazi officers? Now, Hitler is dead. He killed himself. Some other major officers have committed suicide. Some other, major, Nazi officials have fled. A lot of them are going to flee to Argentina. But of the ones that are remaining, what do we do with them? And who do we charge? We're going to have what's known as the Nuremberg trials. And we're going to be really looking at the Nuremberg trials in our Holocaust unit, but I do want to touch on it just very briefly right now. The Nuremberg trials are going to take place in Germany, in Nuremberg, and we are going to hold some Nazis culpable for the crimes against the Jewish people. Like I said, we're going to get more into this in the Holocaust unit, but I do want to make you aware that this is what kind of follows. And that is very, quickly, as quickly as I possibly can, kind of the gist of the Second World War. There's a couple other things that we can talk about. Um, you know, how the war affected the home front in different places. There are going to be heavy civilian casualties in Japan because of those atomic bomb droppings. Over 200,000 civilians are going to die in those two bombings. In the Soviet Union, by the end of the war, they're going to have women serving in the military in roles as like snipers and pilots of bomber planes and things of this nature, and kids as young as 14. In Germany, it's going to be kids as young as 15 that are fighting in the war. Toward the end of the war, when your resources are very low. This war is going to be a war that affects the home front, in that it becomes a total war, and that everybody is working toward that war effort. It's not anything new. We've seen this in the First World War, and we see it again in the Second World War. That is, the longer the war takes place, the more resources are needed, the more manpower is needed in order to continue fighting in this war and meeting both all of the demands of the war with your entire population. So that'll do it for the Second World War. And good luck with your quiz.